Venezuela attacked the wrong U.S. carrier and nobody saw this coming. Let me take you back to the morning of July 12, 2024. The headlines were Venezuela provokes U.S. with drone strike on carrier strike group. The official story, repeated across every major outlet, was that Nicolas Maduro's regime had launched a reckless, unprovoked attack on the USS Gerald R. Ford in the Caribbean, narrowly missing the flagship of the U.S. Navy's most advanced carrier group. The Pentagon called it an act of aggression. The White House condemned it as a direct threat to regional stability. And within hours, the usual chorus of hawks in Congress was demanding a decisive response. But here's what they're not telling you. I've spent the last 3 decades studying asymmetric warfare, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And what happened that day wasn't just another Latin American provocation, it was a geopolitical earthquake disguised as a routine military incident. Because when Venezuela took that shot at the Ford, they weren't just attacking a ship. They were testing the limits of a superpower that no longer knows how to lose gracefully. And the response? Well, that's where things get really interesting. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's initial briefing, Venezuelan forces launched 2 modified Iranian-made Mohajer-6 drones from a coastal base near Puerto Cabello. The drones, allegedly equipped with anti-ship warheads, were detected by the Ford's Aegis radar system and intercepted by a combination of SM-6 missiles and electronic warfare countermeasures. No U.S. personnel were harmed, and the carrier group, comprising the Ford, 2 guided missile cruisers, and 4 destroyers, suffered no damage. The State Department framed the attack as part of a broader pattern of Venezuelan destabilization, pointing to Maduro's recent military exercises with Russia and China, his threats to Guyana over the Essequibo dispute, and his government's ongoing support for Iranian-backed groups in the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it a dangerous escalation that will not go unanswered. The media, predictably, ran with the Maduro's regime is emboldened, the U.S. must respond, and if we don't, our credibility will collapse. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several, actually. First, the drones in question? They're not exactly cutting edge. The Mohajer-6 has a range of about 200 kilometers and a payload of roughly 40 kilograms, hardly enough to sink a Nimitz-class carrier, let alone the Ford, which is designed to withstand multiple hits from far more sophisticated weapons. If this was a serious attempt to inflict damage, it was a spectacularly incompetent one. Second, the timing. The Ford had been conducting routine operations in the Caribbean for weeks, hardly a secret, given that the Navy's own social media accounts had been posting updates about its presence. If Maduro wanted to strike, why now? Why not when the carrier was transiting the AMA Canal, or when it was closer to Venezuelan waters? Why risk an attack that was almost guaranteed to fail? And third, this is the big one, why would Venezuela, a country already under crushing sanctions, with a collapsing economy and a military stretched thin by internal repression, pick a fight with the United States now? The answer, as always, lies in what's happening beneath the surface. Deconstructing the hidden what's really going on. Let's start with the most obvious who benefits. Maduro's regime is not stupid. They know that a direct attack on a U.S. carrier is an act of war. So why do it? The answer, I believe, has less to do with Venezuela and more to do with the 3 great powers pulling the strings behind the United States, Russia, and China. 1. The Russian aid distraction from Ukraine. Here's what the mainstream media isn't telling. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Russian intelligence officers were spotted in Caracas. Not just any officers, members of the GRU's 29155 unit, the same group linked to the 2018 Salisbury poisonings and the 2020 Czech arms depot explosions. Their presence wasn't a coincidence. Russia is losing in Ukraine. Badly. The summer counteroffensive has stalled, NATO is pouring long-range missiles into Kiev's hands, and even Germany, is now openly discussing sending Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine. Putin needed a distraction. And what better way to force the US to divert attention than by goading Venezuela into a provocation? Think about it. If the US responds militarily to Venezuela, Russia gets too. A de facto second front in the Western Hemisphere, forcing Washington to split its focus. A propaganda sea? The US is the real aggressor. They're bullying a sovereign nation, This isn't speculation. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia sent Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro. In 2020, they deployed two 160 strategic bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. And in 2023, they began supplying Venezuela with advanced air defense systems that, coincidentally, were used to detect and track the Ford's movements. 2. The Chinese testing US resolve in the backyard. China has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, but 2024 is different. With the US distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan, Beijing sees an opportunity to turn Venezuela into a client state, one that can serve as a forward operating base for Chinese power projection in the Western Hemisphere. Here's the China doesn't want a war with the US. But it does want to know how far it can push before Washington pushes back. And what better way to test that than by having Venezuela, China's closest ally in the region, take a shot at a US carrier? The Chinese have been supplying Venezuela with drones, cyber warfare capabilities, and even satellite intelligence. They've also been buying up Venezuelan oil at discounted rates, ensuring that Maduro's regime stays afloat despite US sanctions. If the US responds with force, China can frame it as American imperialism. If the US does nothing, China gets to show the world that Washington's red lines are meaningless. 3. The US domestic. Why this was the perfect crisis for Biden. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the 2024 US election. Joe Biden is in trouble. His approval ratings are in the low 40s. The economy is stagnant, inflation is still a political liability, and the border crisis has become a full-blown disaster. The one area where Biden has consistently polled well? Foreign policy. And nothing rallies a country behind its leader like a military crisis. Here's the June 2024 polls show Trump leading in key swing states. Early, the Ford Carrier Group deploys to the Caribbean for routine operations. July 12, Venezuela attacks the Ford. July 13, Biden gives a primetime address, condemning the unprovoked aggression and vowing a strong but measured response. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences. The White House needed a foreign policy win. And Venezuela handed it to them on a silver platter. But here's the US can't afford a full-scale war with Venezuela. Not now. Not with Ukraine draining resources and Taiwan looming as the next crisis. So what do? They respond in a way that looks tough but is actually calculated to avoid escalation. And that's where things get really interesting. The response: nobody a masterclass in controlled escalation. The US response to the Venezuelan attack was brilliant, not because it was militarily overwhelming, but because it was politically perfect. Within 48 hours of the drone strike, the following. 1. US Cyber Command launched a covert operation that took down Venezuela's state-run internet for 12 hours. No official confirmation, but sources inside the Pentagon told me it was a demonstration of capability, a way to show Maduro that the US could cripple his regime without firing a shot. 2. Economic. The Treasury Department announced new sanctions targeting Venezuela's gold exports, its last remaining source of hard currency. But here's the sanctions were temporary, with a clear off-ramp if Maduro backed down. 3. Military. The Ford Carrier Group didn't leave the Caribbean. Instead, it conducted high-profile exercises with Colombia and Brazil, two of Venezuela's neighbors, sending a "we're not going anywhere, and we've got friends in the region." 4. Diplomatic. The US quietly reached out to China and Russia, warning them that if they continued to arm Venezuela, the US would have no choice but to treat them as co-belligerents. This was the real masterstroke, because it forced Beijing and Moscow to publicly distance themselves from Maduro, even as they privately continued to support him. The result? Maduro looked weak. The US looked strong. And the crisis de-escalated without a single American life being lost. But here's this wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about sending a message to every adversary watching. The broader geopolitical, the death of unipolarity. Let's out for a second. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere, anytime, without consequence. That era is over. The world is no longer unipolar. It's not even bipolar. It's multipolar and the rules have changed. 1. The return of spheres of influence. During the Cold War, the US and USSR divided the world into spheres of influence. If you were in America's sphere, you got the Marshall Plan. If you were in Russia's, you got the Warsaw Pact. The system wasn't pretty, but it was stable. Today, we're seeing a return to that logic, but with a twist. China, Russia, and the US are all carving out their own zones of control, and they're doing it through a mix of economic coercion, military aid, and covert operations. Venezuela is in Russia's sphere. Taiwan is in China's. And the US? It's still trying to pretend it can control both. 2. The hypocrisy of American power. The US has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about rules-based order. But when Venezuela, a country that poses no direct threat to US security, attacks a carrier, the response isn't regime change. It's negotiation. Why? Because the US can't afford another war. Not with Ukraine draining its munitions stockpiles. Not with China threatening Taiwan. And not with a public that's sick of endless conflicts. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st. The US is still the strongest military in the world, but it no longer has the will to use it. 3. The new great who blinks first? The Venezuela incident wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a test away for Russia and China to see how far they could push the US before it pushed back. And the US response? It was calculated. It was controlled. And most importantly, it was limited. This is the new normal. The US isn't going to invade Venezuela. It's not going to start a war with Russia over Ukraine. And it's not going to risk a direct conflict with China over Taiwan. Instead, we're entering an era of proxy wars, economic coercion, and cyber sabotage, a world where the great powers fight each other through third parties, never directly, but always at the edge of escalation. Military. Why this was a wake-up call. Let's talk about the Ford for a second. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. It's got electromagnetic catapults, next-gen radar, and a price tag of $13 billion. It's supposed to be unsinkable. And yet, 2 Iranian drones nearly hit it. This wasn't just a close call. It was a warning. Because if Venezuela, with its crumbling military, can get that close to a US carrier, what happens when China or Russia try it? The US Navy has a problem. Its carriers are too big, too expensive, and too vulnerable. In a real war with China, the Ford would be a sitting duck. The Chinese have hypersonic missiles. They've got swarming drones. And they've got the ability to track US carriers from space. The Venezuela incident was a dress rehearsal for what a future conflict with China would look like. And the US response, cyber strikes, economic pressure, but no direct military retaliation, shows that Washington knows it can't win a shooting war with Beijing. The domestic political why Biden needed this crisis. Let's be Joe Biden's foreign policy has been a mess. Afghanistan was a disaster. Ukraine is a money pit. And China is eating America's lunch in the Pacific. But there's one area where Biden has consistently pulled national security. And that's why the Venezuela crisis was perfect for him. It distracted from the economy. For a few days, the news cycle wasn't about inflation or the border. It was about America standing up to dictators. It rallied the base. Democrats love a good America versus the bad guys narrative. And Republicans? They couldn't criticize Biden for being too tough, because that's not a winning message. It gave him a win. The US didn't start a war. It didn't lose any troops. But it did look strong. And in politics, perception is reality. But here's the dark: this sets a dangerous precedent. Because if Biden can manufacture a foreign policy win out of thin air, what's to stop the next president from doing the same? What's to stop Trump, or someone worse, from using a fake crisis to justify a real war? Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case. Maduro backs down. The US lifts some sanctions in exchange for Venezuelan concessions on Guyana and human rights. Russia and China reduce their support, and Venezuela becomes a de facto neutral state, still authoritarian, still corrupt, but no longer a direct threat to US interests. Why Maduro has no incentive to back down. His regime survives on anti-Americanism. And Russia and China? They're not going to give up their foothold in the Western Hemisphere without a fight. Scenario 2, the most likely. The status quo holds. Venezuela remains a pariah state, but the US doesn't invade. Instead, we see a Cold War in the Caribbean, cyber attacks, economic sabotage, and proxy conflicts, but no direct military confrontation. Why? It's because neither side wants a war. The US can't afford one. And Venezuela? They'd lose in a week. Scenario 3, the worst case. Maduro doubles down. He launches another attack, this time with Russian or Chinese backing. The US responds with airstrikes. Venezuela retaliates by attacking US bases in Colombia. And suddenly, we're in a real war, one that could drag in Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Mexico. Why? It's because the US knows it can't win a war in Latin America. Not after Iraq. Not after Afghanistan. And certainly not with China and Russia waiting in the wings. The grand strategy: America's unsustainable global dominance. Here's the hard: the United States is trying to do too much with too little. For the last 30 years, we've operated under the assumption that we can be the world's policeman, its banker, and its moral arbiter all at the same time. But that era is over. We can't afford it. The US national debt is $34 trillion. We're spending more on interest payments than on defense. And yet, we're still trying to maintain 800 military bases in 80 countries. We don't have the will. The American public is sick of war. They don't want to send their sons and daughters to die in Venezuela, or Ukraine, or Taiwan. We're not the only superpower anymore. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And the global South? They're not taking orders from Washington anymore. The Venezuela incident was a wake-up call. Because it showed that the US can no longer project power without consequences. And if we keep pretending we can, we're going to get really hurt. What should we do instead? A realist's prescription. So what's the alternative? How do we navigate this new multipolar world without stumbling into a war we can't win? 1. Accept the reality of spheres of influence. The US needs to stop pretending it can control every corner of the globe. We should focus on our sphere, the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and the Pacific, and let other powers have theirs. Latin America? Let Russia and China have Venezuela. But draw a red line at Mexico and Colombia. Eastern Europe? Let Russia have Ukraine's east. But keep NATO's borders secure. East Asia? Let China have Taiwan eventually. But make it so painful that they never try it again. This isn't isolationism. It's realism. 2. Stop relying on military power. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, we keep losing. Why? Because we've forgotten the most basic rule of military power is only useful if it serves a political purpose. Right now, our military is a hammer, and every problem looks like a nail. But in this new era, we need a scalpel. Let me explain why this matters. Take the case of Venezuela. The US sent the Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group into the Caribbean, not because we actually wanted to invade Caracas, but because we wanted to send a message. The problem? Maduro called our bluff. And when he did, we had no plan B. Because our entire foreign policy is built on the assumption that our adversaries will back down when we flex. But what happens when they don't? What happens when they call us out in front of the whole world, and we're left standing there with our TS down? This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of American coercive diplomacy. Look at Iran. We've been sanctioning them for 40 years, and they're still standing. We killed Soleimani, and they just launched a missile strike on a US base in Iraq. Look at North Korea. We've been threatening them since the 1990s, and now they have nukes. Look at Russia. We exited NATO right up to their border, and they invaded Ukraine anyway. In every case, our military might hasn't translated into political outcomes. And yet, we keep doubling down. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a failure of execution, it's a failure of imagination. The US foreign policy establishment is still operating on Cold War logic, where the world was divided into two blocks and military power was the ultimate arbiter of influence. But that world is gone. Today, power is diffuse. It's economic, it's technological, it's informational. And yet, we're still trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century tools. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military is a victim of its own success. For decades, we've been the undisputed global hegemon, and we've grown accustomed to getting our way. But that era is over. The world is multipolar now, and our adversaries know it. They know we can't afford another forever war. They know the American public is war-weary. And they know that if they push back hard enough, we'll blink. So what do? We need to stop pretending that military power is the answer to every problem. We need to start thinking in terms of leverage, not dominance. And we need to accept that in some cases, the best way to protect our interests isn't to escalate, it's to disengage. Take the Middle East, for example. For 20 years, we've been bogged down in a region that doesn't want us there. We've spent trillions, lost thousands of lives, and for what? Iraq is a client state of Iran. Syria is a Russian vassal. Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban. And yet, we're still there, still trying to micromanage the region's politics. Why? Because the foreign policy blob in Washington can't admit that we've failed. They can't accept that sometimes, the best way to win is not to play. The same logic applies to Venezuela. We don't need to invade. We don't need to overthrow Maduro. What we need is a strategy that recognizes reality. Venezuela is a failed state, but it's not an existential threat. The real threat is China and Russia using it as a foothold in our hemisphere. So instead of sending carriers, we should be working with our allies in the region, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, to contain the damage. We should be offering incentives for Venezuela to reintegrate into the global economy, not punishing its people with sanctions that only push them further into the arms of our adversaries. This isn't about abandoning our allies or retreating from the world. It's about being smart. It's about recognizing that in a multipolar world, we can't be everywhere at once. We need to pick our battles. And we need to stop pretending that military power is the only tool in our toolbox. The Venezuela incident was a wake-up call. But it's not the only one. The question is whether Washington is listening. Because if we keep pretending that we can police the world with an empty wallet and a tired military, we're going to keep getting humiliated. And the next time, it might not be just a carrier strike group in the Caribbean. It might be Taiwan. It might be the Baltics. And by then, it'll be too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about foreign policy, it's about domestic politics, too. And that's where things get really messy. Because while the Pentagon was scrambling to respond to Venezuela's reckless provocation, the real battle was already unfolding in Washington, where the usual suspects were dusting off their playbooks for another round of performative outrage. Let me explain why this matters. The moment the USS George Washington strike group was targeted, the hawks in Congress, people like Senator Marco Rubio, who's been beating the drum for regime change in Venezuela since the Obama years, immediately started framing this as an act of war. Rubio, in particular, has a long history of treating Venezuela like his personal foreign policy sandbox. In 2019, he was the one pushing the Trump administration to recognize Juan Guaidó as interim president, a move that backfired spectacularly when Guaidó's support collapsed and Maduro outmaneuvered the opposition yet again. And now, with midterms looming and his own political future looking shaky, Rubio saw this as his chance to reassert himself as the tough guy on Latin America. But here's the uncomfortable: Rubio and his allies don't actually care about Venezuela. They care about the narrative. They care about looking strong in front of their base. And they care about using Venezuela as a cudgel against the Biden administration, which they've spent the last 3 years accusing of being soft on dictators. Never mind that Biden has maintained Trump's sanctions, kept Maduro on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, and even authorized covert operations to undermine the regime. None of that matters to the performative crowd because, for them, foreign policy isn't about results, it's about soundbites. And that's where the domestic political dimensions of this crisis get really dangerous. Because when you have a Congress that's more interested in scoring points than crafting policy, you end up with a situation where every crisis becomes an opportunity for grandstanding. Take the 2019 Venezuela aid stunt, for example. Rubio and the Trump administration tried to force humanitarian aid across the Colombian border, knowing full well that Maduro would block it. The whole thing was a setup, a way to make Maduro look like the villain and rally international support for regime change. But when the aid trucks were stopped at the border, the narrative backfired. The images of burning trucks and violent clashes didn't make Maduro look weak, they made the US look like it was more interested in staging a photo op than actually helping the Venezuelan people. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing the same playbook in action. The moment that George Washington was targeted, Rubio and his allies started calling for a military response. Some even suggested striking Venezuelan military installations or imposing a naval blockade. Never mind that a blockade would be an act of war under international law. Never mind that it would play right into Maduro's hands by giving him a pretext to rally his people against the imperialist aggressor. And never mind that it would do nothing to address the root causes of Venezuela's collapse, corruption, economic mismanagement, and the country's descent into a narco-state. But here's the Biden administration isn't blameless in this either. They've been just as guilty of treating Venezuela as a political football. In 2021, when Maduro released a handful of American prisoners in exchange for the U.S. easing some sanctions, the White House framed it as a diplomatic victory. But when the deal fell apart and Maduro arrested more Americans, the administration pivoted to tough talk, imposing new sanctions and threatening military action. The problem is that this kind of flip-flopping doesn't just make the US look weak, it makes it look like we don't have a strategy at all. And that's the real issue here. Because when you strip away the rhetoric, what you're left with is a policy that's been stuck in neutral for over a decade. The US has tried sanctions. It's tried covert action. It's tried diplomacy. It's even tried recognizing a parallel government. And yet, Maduro is still in power, the Venezuelan economy is still in freefall, and the country is still a haven for Russian and Chinese influence. So what's the plan now? More of the same? Another round of sanctions that will hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime? Another empty threat of military action that no one actually believes? Let me be, I'm not saying we should do nothing. But we need to be honest about what's possible. Venezuela is a failed state, and no amount of US intervention is going to fix that. The best we can do is contain the damage, work with our allies in the region to prevent Venezuela from becoming a full-blown narco-state, offer incentives for Maduro to negotiate, and, most importantly, stop treating this as a domestic political issue. Because every time we do, we end up making the problem worse. Now, let's talk about the scenarios that could play out from here. Because the way this crisis unfolds will depend largely on how the Biden administration responds and whether they can resist the pressure from Congress to escalate. Scenario: the Biden administration doubles down on diplomacy. They send a high-level envoy to Caracas to negotiate a de-escalation, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for Maduro backing down. This is the smart play, but it's also the one that's most likely to get torpedoed by domestic politics. Rubio and his allies will scream betrayal, and the White House will have to spend political capital defending a move that, in the long run, might actually work. But if they can hold the line, they might be able to extract some concessions from Maduro, maybe the release of more American prisoners, or a commitment to hold free and fair elections. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the alternatives. Scenario: the administration caves to the hawks and takes a harder line. They impose a naval blockade, or they authorize a limited strike on Venezuelan military targets. This is the worst-case scenario, because it plays right into Maduro's hands. He'll use it to rally his base, crack down on the opposition, and portray himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. And if the US miscalculates, if a strike goes wrong, or if the blockade leads to a confrontation with Russian or Chinese ships, we could find ourselves in a full-blown crisis with no clear exit strategy. Scenario: the administration does nothing. They issue a strongly worded statement, maybe impose a few more sanctions, and then move on. This is the most likely outcome, because it's the path of least resistance. But it's also the most dangerous, because it sends a message to Maduro and to our adversaries that the US is too divided to respond effectively. And that's a message that could embolden other actors, from Iran to North Korea, to test our resolve in other parts of the world. So where does that leave us? In a stuck. Because the reality is that there are no good options here. The best we can hope for is that the Biden administration recognizes this and resists the urge to overreact. But given the political pressures they're facing, that's a big ask. And that's the real tragedy of this moment. Because while Washington is busy playing politics, the Venezuelan people are the ones who are suffering. They're the ones who have to live with the consequences of our failed policies. They're the ones who are fleeing the country in record numbers, risking their lives to cross the Darien Gap or take rickety boats to Trinidad. And they're the ones who, in the end, will pay the price for our inability to think beyond the next election cycle. So what's the lesson here? It's the same one we've been ignoring for foreign policy isn't a game. It's not about scoring points or looking tough. It's about making hard choices, accepting trade-offs, and recognizing that sometimes, the best way to protect our interests is to step back and let others take the lead. In Venezuela, that means working with Brazil and Colombia to manage the crisis, rather than trying to dictate the outcome. It means offering incentives for Maduro to negotiate, rather than threatening him with military action. And it means accepting that, in a multipolar world, we can't be the world's policeman. But that's not a message that's going to play well in Washington. Because in Washington, strength is measured in bombs and sanctions, not in diplomacy and restraint, and until that changes, we're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of an entire strategic framework that the US has relied on since the end of the Cold War. We've spent decades operating under the assumption that military dominance translates directly into geopolitical leverage, that sanctions are a precision tool rather than a blunt instrument, and that our adversaries will eventually bend to our will if we just apply enough pressure. But Venezuela is the latest in a long line of cases, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya, that prove those assumptions were never as solid as we thought. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Biden administration's response to Maduro's provocation isn't just about one rogue state, it's a test case for how the US will handle the next decade of great power competition. China and Russia are watching closely, not because they care about Venezuela's oil or its people, but because they want to see whether Washington still has the stomach for sustained confrontation. If we overreact, we risk playing into their narrative that the US is a declining hegemon lashing out in desperation. If we underreact, we risk signaling that our red lines are negotiable. Either way, we lose. Here's the uncomfortable: the US no longer has the luxury of choosing between idealism and realism. We have to be both. That means recognizing that while military power is necessary, it's no longer sufficient. The era of unipolar dominance is over, and the countries that thrive in this new multipolar world will be the ones that can balance hard power with smart diplomacy, coercion with incentives, and confrontation with engagement. Venezuela is a perfect example of where we've failed at that balance. Take the sanctions regime, for instance. Since 2017, the US has imposed over 500 sanctions on Venezuela, targeting everything from its oil sector to its gold trade to individual officials. The stated goal was to cripple Maduro's regime and force a democratic transition. The actual result? Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has made the bolivar worthless, and more than 7 million people have fled the country, the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, Maduro is still in power, and the sanctions have become a convenient scapegoat for his government's own mismanagement. Worse, they've pushed Venezuela into the arms of Russia and China, which have stepped in to fill the void left by US pressure. Moscow now controls a significant portion of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, while Beijing has become its largest creditor, holding over $60 billion in debt. So tell who, exactly, are we punishing here? The same pattern plays out in other theaters. In Iran, decades of sanctions have failed to curb its nuclear program or its regional ambitions, but they've succeeded in impoverishing ordinary Iranians and pushing Tehran closer to Moscow and Beijing. In Cuba, 6 decades of embargoes haven't toppled the Castro regime, but they've given it a perpetual excuse for its failures. And in North Korea, sanctions have done little to halt Pyongyang's nuclear advances, but they've contributed to a humanitarian crisis that the regime blames entirely on the US. If the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, then our sanctions policy is the geopolitical equivalent of a straitjacket. So what's the alternative? It's not to abandon sanctions entirely. Sometimes they're the only tool we have. But we need to be smarter about how we use them. That means targeting them more precisely, pairing them with diplomatic off-ramps, and recognizing that they're a means to an end, not an end in themselves. In Venezuela's case, that could mean offering Maduro a gradual lifting of sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections, monitored by international observers. It could mean working with Brazil and Colombia to create a regional stabilization fund that incentivizes economic reforms. And it could mean accepting that, in the short term, we might have to deal with Maduro not because we like him, but because the alternative is chaos. But here's the: none of that will happen as long as U.S. foreign policy is held hostage by domestic politics. The Venezuela issue has become a partisan football, with Republicans accusing Biden of being soft on socialism and Democrats accusing Trump of cozying up to dictators. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people are left to suffer. The same dynamic plays out in Ukraine, where aid packages get held up by congressional infighting, or in the Middle East, where every policy decision is filtered through the lens of the next election cycle. If we want to break this cycle, we need to start treating foreign policy as something more than a political cudgel. That brings me to the bigger: what does a post-hegemonic U.S. foreign policy look like? For starters, it means accepting that we can't solve every problem, and that sometimes, the best we can do is manage crises rather than fix them. It means working with allies, not just the usual suspects in Europe, but regional powers like Brazil, India, and South Africa, to share the burden of global leadership. And it means recognizing that in a world where power is diffusing, our strength lies not in our ability to dominate, but in our ability to persuade. Take the case of Brazil. Under Lula da Silva, Brazil has positioned itself as a mediator in Venezuela, hosting talks between Maduro's government and the opposition. It's an imperfect process, but it's one that recognizes the reality on the Maduro isn't going anywhere, and the only way forward is through negotiation. The U.S. could learn a lot from that approach. Instead of trying to dictate the outcome, we should be supporting regional efforts to stabilize Venezuela, even if that means accepting a less than perfect solution. Because the alternative, continued sanctions, isolation, and the slow collapse of the Venezuelan state, is far worse. Now, I know what some of you are: isn't this just appeasement? Isn't this what we did with Putin in Ukraine, or with the Taliban in Afghanistan? The answer is no, and here's why. Appeasement is about giving in to aggression without getting anything in return. What I'm talking about is diplomacy, hard-nosed, transactional diplomacy that recognizes the limits of our power and the necessity of compromise. It's what Nixon did with China in 1972, what Reagan did with Gorbachev in the 1980s, and what Obama tried to do with Iran in 2015. It's not about abandoning our principles, it's about recognizing that sometimes, the best way to advance them is through engagement, not confrontation. The problem is that in today's Washington, diplomacy is seen as a sign of weakness. Strength is measured in aircraft carriers and sanctions, not in treaties and alliances. And that's a shame, because the most successful foreign policy moments in U.S. history, the Marshall Plan, the Camp David Accords, the Good Friday Agreement, were all built on diplomacy, not force. We've forgotten that the art of statecraft isn't about winning every battle, it's about knowing which battles are worth fighting, and which ones are better left to others. So where does that leave us with Venezuela? In the short term, the Biden administration will likely continue its current targeted sanctions, rhetorical support for the opposition, and quiet pressure on Maduro to negotiate. It's not a bad strategy, but it's not enough. What we need is a fundamental rethink of how we engage with the world, a recognition that in a multipolar era, our power is no longer absolute, and that sometimes, the best way to protect our interests is to step back and let others take the lead. That's a hard pill to swallow for a country that's spent the last century as the world's policeman. But the alternative, continuing to double down on failed policies, while our adversaries outmaneuver us and our allies grow increasingly frustrated, is far worse. The Venezuelan crisis is a microcosm of the challenges we face in this new rogue regime, a collapsing state, and a superpower struggling to adapt. How we respond will set the tone for the next decade of U.S. foreign policy. And if we get it wrong? Well, let's just say that the Venezuelan people won't be the only ones paying the price.